So I guess I will keep my video on, just that you not only talk to the to the names of the tiles, but I know that I'm wasting energy with it, I guess. On the other hand, the question of what is waste, yeah? So, ladies and gentlemen, 5 p.m. sharply. I'm happy to have you all again to our public lecture series on sustainability in computer science. I'm particularly happy to introduce our speaker of today, Professor René Mayrhofer from the Johannes Kepler University of Linz. René is in fact an experienced scholar in the area of security, but apparently he has also a heart for sustainability, and I'm happy that he accepted the invitation to talk in the realm of our lecture series. And without further ado, René, it's your floor.
Thank you thank you so much again for organizing this lecture series for the Ring Lecture in Sustainability. It's such an important topic. It is arguably one of the most important topics that we have right now as a global community. And so independently of what our specific research focus is, I think we all need to think about that. So again, thanks a lot to you for making this a thing again. And I think it's great that all the major Austrian universities and universities of applied sciences, etc., are again collaborating, and that we can do something like this here just to underscore the importance. Thank you also for the introduction. As already mentioned, my main focus is on security and privacy with mobile devices, with digital identity. I will have a few words about this, but the main focus today really is about sustainability. And sustainability in computer science is a topic that is not very easy to discuss for different reasons. One is we can actually use computer science technology to save on electricity and generally power consumption, on CO2 output, etc. But we also cause a lot of energy consumption through our technologies. Now, where do we stand? Are we actually doing better? Are we making the problem worse? This is what I have been trying to find out with numbers. And I have to say the numbers are maybe an indication. I will come to that towards the end of my lecture today of how good are our estimates. The sneak peek is I hope that we at least have some numbers that are roughly in the order of magnitude. But please do not read into those numbers exactly what the absolute figures are. They are more meant to be an indication of where are we roughly with our energy efforts that we cause through computer science technologies. And with that caveat, I'd like to start with yes, we've all been there. This is what we did at least until about 5 years ago. We came together in lecture halls, we came together in meeting rooms, and even in computer science. For the last 15 years before the COVID pandemic, we had lots and lots of face-to-face meetings. Even for stuff like program committees, we're at academic conferences. It's about discussing which papers are being accepted or not. People were flying together for maybe 1 day, maybe 2 days of face-to-face meetings just to decide which papers to accept at a conference. Occasionally over 50, sometimes close to 100 people were flying together from all over the world to meet for a day or two in one place. That is, of course, hugely wasteful. And we've been forced to learn through the recent pandemic that occasionally it's no longer necessary to come together in the same room. And this Ring Lecture is, I guess, one of the examples of it works. We can do that. We can do much of our work, especially in computer science, without physically having to move to meet each other. Of course, it's not the same, because if you come from being together in one room and being able to judge if people understand you, reading in faces, reading all those subtle signals that we have in human communication, that is being lost. But we have, in many instances, for better or worse, moved from this to that. So now we have a lot of video meetings. And yes, I'm aware of all those discussions in big tech companies of people being forced back into the office just to sit through one video meeting after another in the office, because those are already spread around the world, and those tech companies have already, they have employees that are all over the world. So the new reality in many jobs is basically this. Although that picture is probably one of the nicer ones, if you have the luxury of being able to have your video meetings in in a setting like this, then this probably works well. For many of us, it's probably more like that, having a 1 square meter somewhere in the corner of a loud, noisy living room at home. And yes, I am aware that when we do lectures remotely for example, in our standard lectures, then we compete with the Netflix or other video stream running in the background or in another window or on a tablet in the background. And very often we lose that competition because, come on, we're not all that exciting. I do get it. So yes, how do we deal with video conferencing? This lecture is not about how we best do video conferencing. It's really just building on the assumption that we all do it anyways. And what I'm now trying to set out to do is, let's try to get some numbers of what does this actually mean in terms of sustainability. More specifically, what does it mean in terms of energy consumption, of energy usage that we have through these services? And for that, taking a huge step back, whenever we talk about information, communication technology, ICT, computer science, IT, whatever terminology you want to use, then of course the key is communication. All those services require communication. They require some form of information channels, of data channels to communicate with each other. That requires, on the one hand, a communication medium through which to transmit all those bits and bytes, and it requires services on the other side. Yes, the internet has been designed initially for peer-to-peer communication, for those endpoints to communicate directly through each other or to each other. With IP version 4, because 4 billion are not all that many addresses, considering all the overheads that we have, we typically often no longer communicate directly end-to-end, but through some servers, through some cloud instances. But going back to the communication medium, while it is theoretically possible to have a dedicated communication infrastructure, to have your dedicated communication line, your glass fiber between the 2 points at which you want to communicate with each other, it is much more likely to be using infrastructure that's already available. Maybe with some additional security measures on top, because it's public infrastructure, everybody can use that. But the fact is that most of the communication, pretty much all of the communication that we do nowadays, the digital communication anyways, tends to converge into the internet. So whenever I'm talking about communication in the rest of today's session, I implicitly mean talking through the internet in one way or the other, using the public internet infrastructure for our communication. The numbers that I'm presenting are not representative in case you are thinking about direct communication, having a copper or fiber line, or having a direct wireless point-to-point communication infrastructure between two places. The numbers would not necessarily carry over to that. Now, side note, if we communicate, especially if you communicate through public infrastructure, through the internet, then this creates an attack surface. And this attack surface can be subject to unintentional mistakes that are made by authorized persons or automated processes, which is a safety issue, or intentional attacks by unauthorized persons or processes. And this is why I will a little bit later come back to the issue of security. Because one implication of using communication technology that is publicly available, using the internet, is that you probably need some level of security to use those infrastructures in a way that helps you achieve your goals. And so to counter those attacks that are always existing, that there's always existing when we have this additional attack surface, we will probably also have to spend some additional energy. Now, again, back to the communication medium, because this is the primary target of how do you communicate with each other. Any communication, any digital communication needs both cables and power. I'm not going to talk about what the effort is to lay those cables in the first place, to put up those communication towers for mobile networks, because frankly speaking, we don't have good numbers on that. We know that the whole building technology, digging trenches, laying cables, making them, closing them up again, putting new concrete on top of those trenches where the cables used, where we dug the cables. All that again requires resources and energy effort, but we simply don't know how much. We don't have the numbers. So I'm explicitly not talking about the typically one-time investment of laying those cables. But in the following, I have some numbers or have tried to find some estimates for how much power we need to actually keep them running. And this is what we're trying to check here. Now, the question is, how bad is it really? How much power does our internet communication infrastructure needs? Is it as bad as some people claim? And that was more of a public discussion during the pandemic, during the COVID pandemic. There were some mass media articles of, hey, your Netflix streaming is killing the planet. And I think there were really some headlines along those very lines. And so let's try to find out how bad is it really to send those bits and bytes through the internet and to communicate digitally. Are we making the problem much worse or not? And I would like to start with the example that we're practicing right now. So estimating a Zoom video call in first starting in terms of the network transfer energy consumption. So how much energy are we using right now in the public communication infrastructure by having this lecture here right now? And for that, how do we get estimates? It's fairly hard. I've found somebody has already run through that exercise and actually looked at what Zoom themselves specify of what you will need to have in the sense of minimum network bandwidth to have a relatively good video streaming, video conferencing experience with Zoom. And this is the base numbers that those computations work on. So based on what Zoom publishes, and this is the network bandwidth per second that you need for having a video call, you can just basically multiply that up and come to an estimate of a one-to-one video calling session. So not a group video call at this point, but just one-to-one for 1 hour for each participant. The pure network consumption is in standard video quality, what they call high quality. It's about half a gigabyte for that 1 hour of video call. For HD with 720 or 1080p, it's about a gigabyte or a gigabyte and a half, roughly on network transfer that you cost simply through that. Now we are having a video call here, a group video call. So for a group video call with 5 to 6 participants, the estimates that are given by Zoom itself, by the company, are a little bit higher because you're not watching everybody else's video in a large video call in full quality. So this averages out a little bit. And so for a small-ish video call, group video call, you can estimate about 2.5 gigabytes per hour per participant on just network transfer. Now, if you then estimate of how much it takes to transport 1 gigabyte of data through the typical internet communication technologies, then we come to something between 0.01 and 0.05 kilowatt hours for a one-to-one call, or 0.07 to 0.2 something kilowatt hours for 1 hour with 6 people. Now, If we scale it up to about 1,000 participants and everybody has their video turned on, because Zoom actually scales pretty well with the number of participants, then we can get up to, just with those simple calculations, up to like over 37 kilowatt hours for a 1 hour lecture. So one takeaway is, please do not turn on your video if you are in a very large video call. Yes, it is not nice for the presenter to only talk to black faces. So thanks a lot, Gerti, for being at least one face to speak to. That is not bad from a energy consumption point of view. But if we have hundreds of people in a video call with the video turned on, and yes, I have been part of such video calls where 50 plus, 100 plus people, everybody turns on their video basically just to listen to somebody presenting. You don't get much out of that, because here in my standard view, I see about 5 videos at maximum anyways in that gallery view. Sometimes you have a few with 20 people, you don't see the others, but they are still transmitting, and that requires transmission. So one takeaway is, for large video calls, it probably doesn't make sense for everybody to turn on their video, and there is a real difference in the just energy consumption for the network bandwidth. Now, okay, that's just really network bandwidth. Now, what additional energy do we actually consume for having such a video call? Now, one thing is, which network do you use? What communication technology do you actually use to transmit this kind of data? Are you using fixed lines? Do you use glass fiber, which is pretty good energy-wise for large distance communication? Or do you use the mobile cell-based network for your smartphone? That turns out to consume about nearly 10 times the power per gigabyte transmitted compared to fixed lines. So if you use the mobile phone network for that, then the energy consumption goes up dramatically just for getting the bits across, which, I mean, fair enough. Every radio transmission is mostly, unless you have the most recent technologies with beamforming, is mostly an omnidirectional transmission. And so, of course, you need a lot more power to get the bits across compared to a glass fiber, which is very, very directed. So the communication technology, the medium that you use, makes a lot of difference in the energy consumption that you have. But now, the big elephant in the room is, which device do you use to have this? Are you watching this on a 50 plus inch screen, for example, your TV? Are you watching it on a small phone? Are you watching it on something in between, a laptop or your desktop? That has a pretty big influence on the overall energy consumption, because the viewing device itself needs potentially significant amount of energy. And of course, we need the cloud in between, because rarely with IP version 4 do we communicate directly peer-to-peer to each other. It typically goes through relays, and we need some servers to do that relaying. Through the economies of scale, it's actually better to do that in a tightly packed data center than to do it in on-premise different installations at home that do relay servers. So it's not as bad, but still it factors into the energy that we need. Now, altogether, what does that actually mean? And this is now one slide that I will try to pull up occasionally again and again during the talk to try and compare different services to each other. And I will start this slide, which will appear again with more content later on. I will start it with the Zoom example of video conferencing. So summarizing those numbers from before and factoring in some other estimates by other meta studies, I think at least the order of magnitude is roughly correct, that a group video call with 5 participants for 1 hour in reasonable HD quality will consume round about 0.1 kilowatt hours. Now, is that a lot? What is 0.1 kilowatt hours? If you don't have other numbers in your mind to compare that with, let's take transportation, because video conferencing is the alternative to driving to meet each other in person. And since it has been politically declared that Austria is a country of cars, you can take that as you wish. Let's compare that with cars. And here, if you have an electrically driven battery electric car, then this will give you the power to efficiently drive about 1 kilometer. That is with around about 8 kilometers an hour. If you drive 130, then this will basically go down to about a third of a kilometer. So that's the energy that you have. One person could drive with a battery electric car about 1 kilometer for the energy that we are using for a 5 participant video call with 1 hour. So I think those numbers are a pretty clear indication that if used correctly, internet and the whole computer science technology that we have can really be used to save a lot of energy. Now, we can save even more by moving to audio only. So having just a voice over IP call will probably save about 90% of the energy consumption for having that call. And the best client device is probably having a smartphone on Wi-Fi as the first hop and then having fixed glass fiber connections for the next hops. That's probably the most energy efficient that you can use for live communication. And to be honest, many calls with audio you can already transport a lot. I mean, to be fair, many calls benefit a lot from video. This for if you have got project meetings, if you have to really interactively talk to each other, video will help a lot. And so please enable that. Please don't enable it for a 100+ person call because you can't see anybody else anyways, then maybe it's an audio call. And of course, the old style text communication is the most efficient of all. So the email, instead of having an audio or video call, will save the most if we just look at energy consumption. Not so much if you add video or audio message attachments, of course. Now, I already mentioned this is assuming that we all rely on public infrastructure that's already there, that we don't build something new to just have this kind of communication. So what if we are concerned about the security? Communicating through the internet, does that mean that everybody who has the capability can just listen to our communication, can just read what we are saying? How do we make it roughly as secure as if we were in the same room? So remember, I came with the motivational statement, we want to replace everybody driving together or flying together into the same room. Can we also give roughly the same kind of security guarantees for that communication? And yeah, let's start with the current debate on end-to-end encryption for instant messaging, because we have been partially involved with that debate and it's been going on for 3 years and it's very tiring because the same arguments come up every year again and again. But this is what I think most people will use. A lot more people use live communication through instant messages and or audio calls and or video calls through those instant messengers than they use Zoom for that. So just in terms of economies of scale, this is what we need to look at. How does security, or what does security look like when we talk about instant messaging applications? And the good news is, for the last 5+, nearly 10 years, we have had truly end-to-end encrypted instant messengers that exist and that are in broad use. And the cryptography works. So when implemented properly, if you use messengers like Signal or Wire, or to a certain lesser extent, Threema, Matrix, or WhatsApp, Threema and Matrix, because they use slightly wonky implementations of the crypto protocols that are not quite, not to be considered quite as trustworthy as Signal and Wire, and WhatsApp, because it's closed source, we effectively don't know what it's really doing. If we believe what Meta tells us, then it's using the Signal protocol, so it's considered to be secure. Telegram is not, for example, and many of the other messengers are neither. But if you use any of those, then you can trust with very high probability that nobody can listen into your communication, be that text or audio or video or any other form of messaging or file transfer that you do through those messengers. Now, that means we are secure against being surveilled. Doesn't matter if it's organized crime or law enforcement. If implemented properly, that is as secure or nearly as secure as standing within the same room and talking to each other. We can, I would argue, we can trust those technologies and do not have to meet in person to have a secure private communication. Now, bad news is, they all leak what we consider metadata, like either which phone numbers are connected to each other. And that is my main personal gripe with Signal, my agree to disagree with Moxie Marlinspike, that the Signal, that the voice number, the voice network phone number is not a really good identifier for people because typically you only have one. Trying to not mix that up between personal and business communication is hard, and switching that is very hard. So this you leak. When you talk through those messengers, I mean, Signal has done something to improve that, but mostly when you talk through any of those, you leak your phone number and who is communicating with whom, when, how often, how much you're communicating, which media type, which groups you're a member, etc. And that metadata that is leaked in most of those messengers. Be aware of that. However, coming back to the comparison of moving together into the same room, how different is that really? People can probably see who is going into the same office and record that same data if they so wanted to. Of course, with those messengers, we make it a lot easier for Meta and some other companies to do that recording at scale. So be aware that the metadata is not secure, but the actual content I would consider to be secure. And by the way, Zoom also has end-to-end encryption. It's also proprietary. We cannot check. But we assume that in Zoom, we also secure the content of our communication and group calls sufficiently well. Now, there is a big discussion, which I do not want to go into much detail, but the link is there if you want to know more about the political debate around what's called chat control. Please read it up. That's been ongoing for 3 years. And my only ask to our lovely regulators at the national and the EU level is please do not break our end-to-end encryption. It's one of the few security tools that actually works. And please do not break those few things that we have to secure our digital communication. Now, very small side note. What does that mean for what we consider digital identity? Like, for example, our mobile driving licenses, our passports, etc., which we have in research, and this is our small, yes, this is what we work on part. We have been considering since about 2014, and I cannot give you good numbers, but it's moving into practice. So we are in these years seeing our mobile driving licenses in this very soon, our passports move into mobile phones. We no longer need to print them. We no longer need to send them via post. So we can have some savings there as well, but I can't give you good numbers because it's not yet so widely used in practice that we could really estimate numbers at scale. That has already happened, moving into the smartphone. The next step is moving our digital identity into the cloud, where you will no longer even have to carry your smartphone to enter public transport, to enter your own apartment, to enter your office room, or just travel internationally, but where you can have your digital identity in the cloud. Again, of course, with implications on energy consumption, because there will have to be sensors that do face recognition, that do fingerprint recognition, that compare if you are the one have the capability or the permission to enter that room, etc., to unlock that door. All that will have some impact on energy consumption. And of course, from the security point of view, to come to that angle, the trivial way and the scalable ways to do that in central database, with the mindset of the European values for data privacy and GDPR, etc., I'm not sure it would be a good idea to have Facebook or other big companies be our main gatekeeper of having our biometric information and all the permissions that we should have in the real world. And we also know that this data is gonna be stolen. If you've got a couple of 100 million digital identities collected in one place, take your pick of any of those big companies. They're all on that list that have been breached before. Yeah, Facebook is on there multiple times. I'm aware of that. And some other pretty big organizations, including, for example, the biggest collection of digital identities for digitally mediated communication through cloud, which is the Indian Aadhaar system. All those have already lost some part of their identity data. So let's not do that. Our research proposal is to do that in a decentralized way of having your own pick of where to store your digital identity. Now, putting that aside, because I cannot give you good numbers, this is just a sneak peek of what we're looking into for securing digital authentication in the future. One thing that I have to pull up here is what we call supply chain security, because an implication of communicating digitally is that you have to trust your software and partially hardware. And that means you have to trust a lot of components, a lot of moving components. If we use Zoom, you have your operating system, you have the Zoom client, you have the Zoom server. If you have your instant messenger, you have the mobile phone hardware, you have the mobile phone client. You have additional services that are required to be used. Those can be the relay services to communicate, or something as simple as a DNS or a time service. And all those services are dependencies that you explicitly or implicitly use. Now, did I consider the energy consumption of querying the DNS service for Zoom? No, probably because it's insignificant to the live data transmission of video, but also because we don't have good energy consumption numbers. So we only have all those dependencies, all those services, all those software libraries that you download, all those updates, we have that somehow in the average of all the data centers that we use for digital communication, for digital services. So we have it in our numbers, but I can't tell you exactly how much effort that is. However, since we are still in that concern of security and how much does security cost, there is a security effort in using digital services to use them securely. And a lot of that security effort is in what we now consider the supply chain security, making sure that you have up-to-date libraries, making sure that all your services are simply working if you depend on them is a huge effort. And I really just want to point out, without going into much detail, that yes, this is an implication. If you want to save on physical transportation of people or goods by doing it only digitally, you need to care about those things. So you don't get the energy savings for free, but you have some trade-offs with security, and you need to make sure that this is done correctly, or people will just simply stop using it digitally and go back to the more wasteful shipping things and people around. Can we measure that? So I hope I have made my point that for digital communication, if we want to use that to save energy consumption, we need security, and security needs a lot of layers. But security requires energy. And if we talk about just the cryptography, about encryption and signatures and running the organizational monsters that we consider to be public key infrastructures, of having automated testing for security bugs, fuzzing, and other security testing infrastructure, which can consume quite a lot of computational power, by the way. If you run a fuzzer against open source libraries that are used a lot in practice, that requires significant commitment for keeping those fuzzers running, keeping them throwing effectively random inputs at software to see if it falls over. That is what fuzzing is. It is really a brute force effort to security testing, and that has an energy impact. To auto updates, can we estimate how much energy we consume by constantly checking for updates and every couple of days updating your apps on your phone? I don't have good numbers, but it's not nothing. It is probably a significant energy consumption that is being used just to keep our software up to date in terms of security updates. Or going further, if we want to secure our supply chain, we might want to have public logs of all the software and software libraries that are supposed to be out there, have public transparency logs for that. All that requires effort. All that requires energy consumption. I don't have good numbers, but I know that Daniel has some very nice numbers on what is the energy cost of security measures. So please see next week's talk by Daniel Cruz on that. He has got really good insight and really good numbers in measuring our security mitigations in terms of energy consumption. In my talk, since I focus more on the global impact of certain technologies, those are kind of rolled into all those numbers, but we need to ask the question of, can we do better in terms of security mitigations with regards to energy? And this is next week's talk. So sneak peek, please watch that as well. Now, security aside, assume that we have security in place for the rest of my talk. Can we compare that to some other services? So of course, Netflix streaming, and I'm using Netflix because it's one of the most commonly used examples. Replace that with any video streaming service. It will probably be roughly within those numbers, at least within the same order of magnitude. There are some very different estimates. So I've tried to find some good numbers, and it turns out that depending on who does the meta study and how do they estimate the energy consumption, it can differ widely from something between 0.9 kilowatt hours per gigabyte to 0.1 to 0.2 kilowatt hours per gigabyte. And that depends a lot on your assumptions. Are you assuming wireless transfers through the mobile phone network? Are you assuming what is the cloud infrastructure? Do you have a content distribution network in place that has the video streaming cached content very close to a data center to your location? Or do you have to stream it across most of the globe? So I think there are wildly different assumptions going into those estimates. And this is why the numbers are not really good. But at least within the order of magnitude, let's assume we have somewhere between 0.1-ish and 0.1 and 0.5 kilowatt hours per hour of streamed video. Now here, it turns out that the network communication effort might not be the biggest one. For video streaming in particular, the choice of your viewing device matters a lot because, as you can see, and these are numbers I just got from trying to read some specifications of common devices. So there's no meta study that I found. If you look at some TVs, then those are typically between 50 to 200 watts that you use by just having turned on your big screen. A desktop computer can go as low as 50 watts, including a reasonably sized screen, can go up to way beyond 500 watts if you've got a tuned gaming machine sitting at home and idling away with two GPUs that really make your cooling system glow. Laptops can also vary widely. You can have some, for example, ARM CPU-based laptops that get away with 5 watts in idle. 10 watts in video streaming. They can also go way up beyond 150 watts if it's a gaming laptop with a heavy GPU and so on. But as you can see, a smartphone, and to a certain lesser extent a tablet, is a very efficient viewing device. Now, in certain regions of the world, Asia and others, people primarily watching videos on a smartphone is not the worst thing from an energy consumption point of view. So if you watch video streams, then yes, it matters that you do that through live streaming, but the choice of viewing device matters actually a lot more. For audio streaming, for music streaming, that difference is obviously even bigger. If you stream audio, if you stream music to your TV and that just displays a nice whatever screensaver picture and you only use your TV as an audio output device, that's pretty bad in terms of energy consumption. So please don't do that. For audio consumption, the viewing device has probably, if you use the right one, has probably a lot lower consumption. And here, radio power requirements matter much more. Is there a question? No, I think that was just an audio artifact at the moment. But still, if you do a lot of audio streaming, you can save a lot of the network bandwidth by just using locally cached music or video files. If you have an audio streaming service that allows you to pre-cache files or some music that you often listen to, please use that cache on your local device because you can save on the transmission. Now, as promised, coming back to our comparison of different services, video conferencing, when we compare that to video streaming, it's roughly in the same order of magnitude. So for 1 hour group video call with 5 participants versus 1 hour of particularly Netflix streaming, but because people have looked at those numbers, I think they are representative for other streaming services as well. We are at roughly 0.1 to maybe 1 kilowatt hours per hour. The video viewing device matters a lot more. So depending on a TV screen, which will maybe consume about 100 times the energy, or a laptop that will consume about 5 times the energy compared to a smartphone, you can make a big difference in the energy consumption. And for smartphone viewing, it really matters a lot if you do that through the mobile cell-based network, or if you do that through fixed fiber connections and only have the last hop on Wi-Fi. So if you can choose, maybe please use Wi-Fi that is connected to a good, efficient fiber line instead of doing the streaming all through the phone network, even if in Austria we have the luxury of having pretty cheap mobile phone tariffs with more or less unlimited data transfer. It still costs in energy. Now, another thing to maybe consider is please use your devices as long as you can, because it turns out that for TVs, it's about 30%. For smartphones, it's about 80% of the energy effort throughout the lifetime of the device goes into the production. So once you've bought your smartphone, it doesn't matter that much from an energy perspective on how often you use it, because the most effort you already paid by having it produced. So using it as long as possible is important if we want to be energy efficient with our computer science services. And now, the elephant in the room, what do our data centers produce? All those cloud servers, all those video, audio streaming servers, all those Zoom relays. Turns out that some numbers point to this being roughly on the level of what the network transmission costs. So if we assume a global annual energy consumption of about 250 terawatt hours, then about 200 terawatt hours are the data centers. So this is a rough estimate. Roughly as much energy consumption for the actual computation and data storage as we require, globally speaking, for the data transmission. And those two together consume about 2% of the annual global energy consumption. So it is significant, because between 2 and 3% of the global energy consumption is assumed to be all of air travel. So we, as a community in computer science, consume about as much energy as the whole of the airline industry these days. 200 plus 250 terawatt hours a year. Now, is that a lot? I will come back to that with some more numbers, but just small warning, depending on what you choose, which service you choose, Zoom or Netflix or some others. One big effect is what we consider to be vendor lock-in, because most of those services that we use these days, and that extends to the Signal and Wire and others instant messengers that I mentioned, they are islands. You cannot easily move from one to another. If you are in Signal and you do all your communication Signal, you're as beholden to that vendor as you are with Zoom and some others. And if they add some additional services, if they up their energy consumption, if they up their prices, it's pretty hard to get out of those ecosystems as well. So my best request here is we should focus more on open protocols for those kinds of communication than on specific services. But at the moment, this is not so easy to actually pull off. Now, as I've been talking about security a little bit, there is another thing that we probably need to talk about, because when you talk about security, the last 5 years, you had to talk about blockchain and cryptocurrencies, because security and cryptocurrencies was somehow mixed up in one bag. That hype has passed a little bit, but let's talk about blockchain. Let's talk about blockchain and the energy consumption. There have been some pretty good numbers that have been collected by the University of Cambridge and others, for example, here under Bitcoin energy consumption and some other web pages, that point to about 100 to 200 terawatt hours per year just for Bitcoin. This is only estimates for Bitcoin energy consumption, not any of the other cryptocurrencies. There are more other blockchain-based cryptocurrencies out there, and because of their proof of work usage for distributed systems coordination, they waste a lot of electricity. Now, 100 to 200 terawatt hours, how good are those numbers? The honest answer is those are estimates. And I've checked again, as of about 6 months ago, that same web page has changed to using slightly more detailed graphs. I'm still using the other one if I want to make a point, because this one is harder to read. The bold line in the middle, the bold yellow line, that is their best average estimate, but the area, the yellow area, is the estimated minimum and maximum figures for every one of those time periods. So depending on which calculation you apply, depending on which assumptions you apply, you have wildly different estimates of what the Bitcoin energy consumption actually is. I mean, it's still within roughly the same 100 to 200 terawatt hours per year. Now, I do want to quickly move back to this one because it's much easier to read. You can see a big drop here between 2022 and 2023, right? Why is there a big drop? Why did energy consumption go down in Bitcoin suddenly, which is weird? China. So, by the way, security assumption is that nobody controls more than 51% of the whole of all the nodes that run this blockchain for it to be secure. At that point in time, about 75% of all Bitcoin mining nodes were in China. They consumed so much electricity that the electricity grid went into brownouts. So the electricity grid went down because of Bitcoin mining, and China regulated through law, basically making it illegal that Bitcoin mining would no longer happen in China. And this is the point in time when we can see it in numbers that this happened. Bitcoin miners had to leave China and move to Kazakhstan and Texas and other countries where electricity is still cheap and they're not being banned. That caused an immediate drop, about halving the energy consumption of running Bitcoin. Well, it went up from there again. So at some point in the middle of 23, if you look at the new numbers, it went up again to never seen heights before. Is that a lot? Again, the question, how bad are we? What do those numbers actually mean? So what do they mean? In 2021, before the drop, if you look at Bitcoin and its estimated 200 terawatt hours per year, and compare that to the electricity consumption of whole countries, then this was right in between Thailand and Vietnam. After the big drop, so after it halved roughly in 2023, it went down to 75 terawatt hours roughly. That was just a little bit above the whole electricity consumption of Austria, right on the left side. So just the Bitcoin blockchain for cryptocurrency consumed more electricity than all of Austria. All our heating, all our industry, all our light, all our transportation, everything together in 23 was not enough to account for the energy consumption of just Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency. Now, the argument has been made that, well, this drives renewable energy because it needs clean energy. And of course, those Bitcoin miners will move to wherever there's clean, for example, solar energy. There are some other studies, unfortunately, only until 21. I'm not sure if it has changed a lot from them, which paint a dirty picture of 30% of that being coal. And yes, we know that, for example, for Kazakhstan, after Bitcoin miners left China or had to leave China in 2023, some old, previously deactivated coal power plants in Kazakhstan were reactivated to power Bitcoin mining. So not a good thing. And let's not even get into what an NFT is, the non-fungible tokens. That was one of the largest scams, globally speaking. Yes, I'm being very frank here. It was a scam. And I am very disappointed to say that the Austrian Post AG, has recently done some marketing of, hey, we have some post stamps as digital NFTs. So they still haven't gotten over the hype. I'm not talking more about this because it's just too frustrating a topic in energy waste. If you want to know what an NFT is, I can recommend this YouTube video linked here in the slides, which will be available on the webpage after we finish. But there are also blockchain type cryptocurrencies that do not use proof of work. And yes, they do not needlessly waste all that energy. Ethereum is probably the most well-known cryptocurrency that is used on proof of stake instead of proof of work. So this is, from an energy point of view, much, much, much better. So they don't waste as much money, as much energy. They just base the decisional power on how much money somebody has invested into their nodes compared to how much energy they waste in running the nodes, basically. This is different assumptions, but there are some that are still the same. Like, do you really want all your transactions to be irreversible? because this is what a blockchain does. It makes something irreversible. It's there forever. And as long as that chain is kept alive, as long as that chain exists, that one statement, that transaction is irreversible in the chain. That is the point of having a blockchain public ledger. Or maybe to put it more directly, do you never make any mistakes? Because undoing mistakes on a blockchain is kind of hard because the technology doesn't want you to let you do that. Do you really want to publish all details of all your transactions? Because this is what happens. Do you really want every single node to mirror the whole multi-tens of gigabytes chain that you already have collected over the couple of years? It's not very efficient in terms of transmission and in terms of having to store that. Are there really no trusted third parties that you can together decide that you place some trust in? And how many transactions per second do you actually need? Do you need this to be fast, or can you wait 10 minutes for something to be actually acknowledged through the chain? And if you talk about proof of stake, do you really want the rules to be written by whoever has more money in the system than you do? Because this is what proof of stake means in terms of proof of work. If you're basically saying no to any of those questions before, then maybe blockchain is not the answer for you, and maybe you should use some other a lot more efficient technologies instead of blockchain. Now, let's put that into perspective, into those numbers that I had before. That 1 hour Netflix video streaming with the roughly 0.1 to 1 kilowatt hours. 1 hour of video streaming, if you compare that to what you need for a single Bitcoin transaction, which is over 2,000 kilowatt hours, you can do 2,000 hours of Netflix streaming for one Bitcoin transaction. So I think the answer to whoever was very concerned that by streaming during the pandemic or afterwards is burning up the planet is, if you hold Bitcoin, please don't, because anything that you do with video streaming does not matter in comparison to doing Bitcoin. And those 200 terawatt hours compared to Bitcoin, yeah, well, as you can see here, this is roughly the order of magnitude of just running the Bitcoin blockchain. So the Bitcoin blockchain requires nearly as much electricity as all the major data centers together. All the other services that we have in the cloud require as much energy as just running the Bitcoin blockchain, just to put that in perspective. Now, there's another big elephant in the room that we've had for a couple of years now. That picture that I had before on the slide on is proof of stake our solution was generated helpfully by a generative AI framework. So generative AI is a thing. It gives us not just cute cats, but also cute mice, because the whole internet is not only cute cat videos. Now we also get cute mouse videos that are generated by AI. How does that stack up in terms of energy consumption? It's hard to say, to be honest, because having good numbers right now is hard because it's still in the early phase of the hype cycle, so it's growing rapidly right now. And any numbers that have been estimated maybe a month or two in the past are probably not good numbers at the moment. So the best that I could find was an estimate that was actually done by the International Energy Agency. They're typically conservative with the numbers that they release, is that they estimate all our data centers to probably require somewhere between 620 and 1,050 terawatt hours per year by the year 2026. Compared to the last number estimates of 2022, that is a sharp rise in what our data centers need. And the estimates is based on what people think generative AI will cause in additional electricity consumption between 100 and X 100 terawatt hours per year in additional energy consumption. So that rise of all data centers together. Oh, by the way, sorry, those numbers are data centers plus network infrastructure. So if we didn't have AI, then from 450 to 600 something is probably a little bit of AI computation rolled in. But the big uncertainty factor is because we don't know how far that hype cycle is going to go. How many more data centers are going to be built because of GPU clusters and computation for generative AI, machine learning services, large language models, et cetera, et cetera. We don't know yet. The uncertainty is very high, but we know that it consumes a lot of energy. And best estimates right now are that within a year or two, it will probably be in the range of what Bitcoin already is. It's a massive amount of energy for, I mean, yes, not only generating cute mouse pictures, but the whole field does have a lot of impact. Now, finally, critically, because we are trying to do this on a scientific footing, how good are any of those estimates? How good are any of those numbers that I tried to present today? And my best answer is, I don't know. I don't know how good they are. These are based on some meta studies and they can differ a lot because most of those numbers really are extrapolated. And trying to figure out how much energy we use per gigabyte transferred as one multiplicative factor is not a good number. We know that because there's a significant base level of electricity that we require to just keep our routers running, to keep the network lines running independently of how much we transfer. So the first gigabyte is the most expensive. The next one is not as expensive. But those are all just average figures and they're not really good at all. For data centers, it's even worse because for data centers, it's very hard to measure. The operators do not tell you. So some of those numbers come from estimates of indirectly what a company reports as cost for a data center, dividing that by the energy cost for that and coming up with some energy consumption figures. Those are all very rough extrapolations of just a few data points. It's also changing rapidly because of GPU power for machine learning. So the answer is those numbers, they are not good. Client device usage also depends a lot on how you use it. How often is it in standby? How big is it? Is the improved energy efficiency by new CPUs that's counteracted by increased usage, etc. So I think the honest answer is those numbers are not good. Why do I dare to quote them? Because I've tried to compare a number of different studies and I've taken numbers where different kinds of studies with different methodology and coming up with those numbers come at least to the rough order of magnitude of the same usage. So I think it's an indication of how good or how bad some of those things are. But please do not take any of those absolute numbers as true estimates of what we really consume, just as some guidance for maybe deriving what we should and we shouldn't be doing. And with that, thanks a lot for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions except maybe that obvious one that I've tried to answer.
So, great. I don't ask the last question. Thank you very much. It was really, but I always think the same. Yeah? I don't have to read a krimi anymore, some thriller. This is thriller enough. So I have a couple of questions, but I also now open the chat. So if students would also like to ask something. Okay. You were mentioning, please keep the end-to-end encryption. Yeah? And not least since this, what is her name? I don't even know this canceling of the concert of.
Yes, Swift.
Thank you, Swift, Taylor Swift. There is, of course, a huge argument by the politicians, why they, and so on and so forth. And also, pornographic data is always a very argument used why end-to-end encryption shouldn't be kept. What would you argue? And I totally agree with you, but how to counter-argue this kind of attempts by the politicians?
So the case of the Taylor Swift concerts is the most egregious one because the argument by the Ministry of Internal Affairs and some other politicians that they should have been able to surveil some of that communication is completely wrong. They actually communicated, and that has been published afterwards. They communicated through open Telegram groups. They could at any time just have read those same Telegram groups that probably the CIA did and gave them the hint. So they wouldn't have needed any other technical or regulatory means to do that. They just don't have the staff to do that. And I sympathize because getting enough people to do that is hard. Making the haystack bigger by surveilling more private jets doesn't help them in most of those cases. There is a question in the chat that I saw. Old devices versus new devices in energy consumption. Yeah, good point. Newer devices are more efficient, but for example, for smartphones, 80% of your whole energy consumption you've already paid by the production cost. So depending on the device type, it really is helpful by it's really helpful to keep devices around as long as possible. Again, the security argument is a bit counter to that because many old devices don't get security updates anymore, so they are not safe to use, which is one reason why the regulation, at least on the EU level, is now to force vendors to provide security updates for at least the expected lifetime of the hardware itself. So we are moving into keeping hardware around much longer, even if it is less efficient. But the numbers point a pretty clear picture that it's better from an energy resource consumption point of view to use old devices, at least to a certain extent, before replacing them, because the production cost itself is significant for those devices.
May I just step in here because always say I'm old from another time, but especially when you brought up this argument, I was writing down refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle. This is what at least my kids have learned in school, yeah? And I think this is here exactly the point, even this for all other things in our life, but we have too much, we should. Wouldn't it be, especially if the whole, as an e-waste is a huge problem we have now. I mean, this is that we would have to invest much more in how to reuse the e-waste, because we don't have the raw material anymore at a certain point.
Yeah, absolutely. So use devices for as long as possible. When we talk about sustainability, that's the only real effective answer. And it's hard. And yes, energy devices are getting more energy efficient from generation to generation, but that does not make up for producing new ones. Now, I see another question, renewable energies and Bitcoin power usage. That is an argument that people make, but the numbers that I've seen point a different picture that no, it's not actually that Bitcoin uses mostly renewable energies. They use the cheapest energy, the Bitcoin miners. And that is oil power in Texas right now and coal power in Kazakhstan. That is the cheapest power because reasons. If data centers and Bitcoin miners really wanted to use renewable energy, then they could be doing that, but it has an implication. Renewable energy is not a constant source. If you rely on wind, you rely on solar power. Hydropower is something that we have in Austria that is not as prevalent in other countries and not as widely available. So what we can scale is wind and solar, and that's not always available. So I have been trying to make the argument, even just here at our small JKU, which has a bit of an electricity problem, I would say, compared to some others. We use a lot of electricity as a university to run our data centers when we have the solar surplus during the day. But that means shutting down servers when you don't have it, which is a slightly changed way of approaching this. And I don't know of any Bitcoin miners that do that. I mean, for stuff like Bitcoin, it would be so easy to adapt to use the power when it's there and shut down your services when you don't have local power. But for economic reasons, people don't do that. So I haven't seen numbers that back the argument that most of Bitcoin power usage is using renewable energies. And because of generative AI, most of the big tech companies, I'm not naming names, but you can look at their reports, pretty much all of them have effectively silently canceled their promises of becoming energy neutral within the next couple of years. Those promises have just vanished from their reports in the last year. And the reason is electricity consumption by generative AI. Comparing Bitcoin to normal bank transactions, I don't have good numbers. There are numbers. I've seen them in the past. I believe it was somewhere in the range of a couple of 100,000 Visa or MasterCard credit transactions for a single Bitcoin transaction. But I don't have the numbers here on slides. I would need to look them up. Yes, those numbers exist. Standard electronic bank or credit card transactions are vastly more efficient than standard Bitcoin. For Ethereum, it's different, but Ethereum doesn't see that kind of major use yet. So I'm not sure if there are good numbers at the moment for Ethereum as a pure cryptocurrency and not as a smart contract vehicle, which I think is what most people use Ethereum for.
I mean, there was also one that, we should go into renewable energy, make it cheaper and get the, but this is, I guess, yes, is one way to go also. But here we also have to find, how to store energy and all this problem you already mentioned, yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
I guess we are done. René, it was amazing. Just, please send me your slides as usual so we can put them online if it is okay for you. I see that you have quitted your Twitter account apparently.
Yes. It's no longer a good source for facts at the moment. I've switched completely to Mastodon at this point.
Yeah, so I guess this is almost a political statement now, which I can really enjoy.
Yes, it's partially a political statement, but partially also because really I've seen, for me personally, the utility of Twitter as a source of security news, which I used it for. Typically, I knew in about 6 hours roughly when something major happened from a security incident point of view, globally speaking. Now I get most of that through Mastodon, and I no longer got it through Twitter. So yeah,
Okay,
utility.
this is a professional argument. Really, many thanks for your presentation. Amazing. Thank you for all the participants. I don't have to introduce our next speaker. It was already done by René. So next week it really fits nicely. See you next time. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for the attendance. Have a great week. Goodbye.
Thank you.